The foundational premise of every Abrahamic religion is absolute. God is perfectly, entirely good. He cannot author evil, and he cannot act with malice. Yet, anyone reading the historical accounts of the Old Testament immediately collides with a harsh reality. During the conquest of Canaan, this same perfectly good God issued a mandate demanding mass slaughter. The Hebrew texts call this specific protocol Haram. It translates to a command to dedicate an entire population to complete eradication, sparing no living thing. And this creates a profound philosophical fracture. How do we reconcile an omnibenevolent creator with a directive to annihilate entire communities, including women and children? Evaluating this text through a modern humanitarian framework leaves us at a dead end of contradictions. To understand what is actually happening in these passages, we have to look deeper into the architecture of the text itself. To resolve this tension, we need to reverse engineer the Haram command, stripping away modern assumptions to see how it functioned in its original environment. We will do this by applying three analytical lenses: the military history of the ancient Near East, the philosophical framework of divine command theory, and the theological principle of progressive revelation. The goal is not to excuse or sanitize ancient bloodshed. Our objective is to uncover the structural logic behind it. By decoding the internal logic of this command, we can map the relationship between divine authority and the definition of goodness. We begin with the geographical and historical reality. The ancient Near East was a brutal, tribal landscape governed by constant territorial conflict. The Old Testament legislated two completely different categories of warfare. Outside Canaan, Israel was required to offer peace treaties first, and strictly forbidden from killing non-combatants. Inside Canaan, the command flipped to an isolated mandate for absolute eradication, designed specifically to prevent religious contamination. Scholars refer to this inner zone protocol as Yahweh's war. In these battles, God deliberately handicapped the Israelite army, banning chariots, drastically reducing troop numbers, and relying on strategies like marching around Jericho. The text implies the victory was an act of divine judgment, not human military prowess. The Canaanite destruction was highly compartmentalized. It directly defied the standard military logic and imperial expansionist strategies of the era. This brings us to a critical debate regarding the text itself. When the narrative says they destroyed everything that breathes, are we reading a literal physical reality or ancient political rhetoric? This carving displays stylized rows of archers. Scholars like Paul Copan argue for a hyperbolic interpretation based on this style of warfare, pointing out that claiming absolute annihilation was merely a figure of speech used by kings to announce decisive victories. There is textual evidence for this view. Later chapters in the same book explicitly forbid the Israelites from intermarrying with the Canaanites, which would be impossible if the entire population had been physically annihilated. Conversely, the literalist view, supported by scholars like Clay Jones, asserts the destruction command was a real, absolute historical mandate. Treating the violence as mere hyperbole fails to explain other catastrophic events, such as the flood or the destruction of Sodom, where the erasure of life is presented as an objective physical reality. But even in the literal view, this was not ethnic cleansing. Canaanites who defected, like Rahab, were integrated into Israel. Meanwhile, Israelites who adopted the practices being judged, like Achan, were executed. The judgment was strictly about behavior, not bloodline. Whether we read these passages as exaggerated military rhetoric or as a literal historical judgment, the target was religious corruption, not genetic eradication. Let's pivot from history to the philosophical engine driving it. Why exactly was the destruction of this corruption considered morally good? To answer that, we have to navigate the Euthyphro dilemma, a challenge from Plato's writings that questions the source of moral authority. The Euthyphro dilemma asks, is an action good merely because God commands it, making morality arbitrary? Or does he command it because it's already good, making him secondary to an external rulebook? To resolve this, philosophers propose the modified divine command theory. Under this framework, morality flows directly from God's unchanging character. He does not invent morality, nor does he submit to a higher law. His nature is the objective standard. Therefore, a command to judge extreme evil is not a lapse into arbitrary violence. It is the logical reaction of pure goodness encountering pure corruption. To grasp the severity of this judgment, we have to examine the archaeological reality of Canaanite society. The text states the land was ready to vomit them out. This was a culture entrenched in systemic violence, most notably the ritual practice of throwing infants into fire to appease the god Moloch. This forces us to confront the most difficult objection directly. Even if the adults were corrupt, what about the Canaanite infants killed in the crossfire of this mandate? Philosopher William Lane Craig addresses this through a framework known as skeptical theism, focusing on the eternal fate of those children. The core theological premise here is that infants possess no moral culpability. Because of this, their physical deaths meant they passed instantly into the eternal paradise. In this framework, the physical death of these children is viewed as an act that transferred them from a corrupted culture into eternal safety. The psychological burden then rests not on the victims, but on the soldiers tasked with carrying out the judgment. Theologian Meredith Kline expands on this by arguing that human existence is a grace period, delaying an inevitable judgment. In the conquest of Canaan, that grace period for a specific civilization was revoked. If God is perfectly just, why does the warlike God of the Old Testament appear so different from the forgiving Jesus of the New Testament? Historical theologians answer this using the concepts of progressive revelation and divine accommodation. Consider a doctor mixing bitter medicine into a sweet syrup so a patient will swallow it. God condescended to the tribal realities of ancient humans, communicating with them at their level of understanding in the military language of the time. Bloody warfare was never the primary design. It was a secondary necessity used to deal with the stubbornness of humanity operating in a fractured world. The Old Testament portrays a divine justice acting within the constraints of an ancient culture, paving the way for a higher standard to eventually arrive. That higher, ultimate standard of God's character is found in the person of Jesus Christ. This is the Christological standard. If Jesus didn't do it or teach it, it is not the eternal nature of God. Compare the violence of the Canaanite conquest with the climax of the New Testament at Calvary. Here we see a subversion of power. Instead of slaughtering his enemies to achieve military victory, God incarnates sacrifices himself to save those exact enemies. At the cross, the requirement for justice against evil and the intent to preserve humanity meet. The judgment is directed at the Son rather than the population. The severity of the Old Testament is not a contradiction of God's goodness. It is a localized historical prelude that leads directly to the saving mercy of the cross.